for a perfect segue from Ulrike's lecture, because I will share with you a case study from my personal experience with the title that not every tradition is good tradition on the case of teenage butchers. So food is essential for our survival, and it's not surprising that part of individual and cultural identity is built on it. In our society, in the context of food industry, violence towards animals that we view as resources is considered to be acceptable and necessary part. In many countries, the slaughter of animals has also the status of cultural heritage. This is the case also in Slovenia, where Koline is the autumn and spring extended family gathering in the countryside where pigs are slaughtered. With industrialization, the meat production has changed dramatically over the last century, from farmers raising individual animals for meat to large factory farming complexes, to the automatization of meat production, which has allowed for a significant increase in the number of slaughtered animals. The industrialization of the meat industry has transformed the slaughtering of animals from 1 to 2 time event per year, as mentioned before, to vocation where slaughtering animals is 8-hour workday job description. In the context of the food industry, non-human animals are objectified and commodified as depersonalized market products. Although in Slovenia, animals were recognized as sentient beings from the March 2020, the same law in the consequent articles stipulates that there are 20 legal ways in which animals may be killed. Legitimization of killing of sentient beings is rooted in normalization of violence towards non-human animals. Normalization refers to social processes through which ideas and actions are seen as normal and natural and renders something acceptable that it's otherwise not. As Križanovsky suggests, normalization discourse is context-dependent. In the case of food industry, violence is rarely considered violence, as Jadikola points out in their book Violence, Inequality and Human Freedom. Modern factory farming and production line slaughtering system for routine mass killing of sentient beings is a result of gradual process of normalization of violence towards them. However, the aim of this paper is to point out how dangerous and damaging normalization of violence towards non-human animals essentially is, and how far-reaching its consequences in reality are. Industry whose core business is routine mass killing of animals is very different from all the rest. As Rowling pointed out, killing has an evolutionary rooted negative impact on our nervous system that causes severe moral stress in perpetrators. Significant parallels in this context can be drawn also between military and slaughterhouses. As Grossman pointed out, humans exhibit high resistance to killing and hurting other sentient beings. Therefore, military's primary focus is on finding effective means of enabling and conditioning people to overcome their natural aversion to killing. The dissonance between reluctance to kill and executing the kill triggers development of various types of coping mechanisms in forms of distancing, such as physical, emotional, mental, moral, and it was found that the act of killing directly affects the perceived levels of well-being in perpetrators. Paran and his team explored the intentional killing of animals in workplaces in the context of dirty work and found that abattoir workers report lower physical and psychological well-being when compared with 44 other occupations, and that the act of intentional killing of animals proved to be a key difference when compared with other occupations. Act of killing was the single reason for lower levels of well-being. Slaughterhouse workers were also found to be significantly differ in other occupations in increased alcohol consumption during weekdays, during weekends, feeling less rested in the morning after a day of work, reporting lower likelihood of being able to perform the same job in 2 years, reporting reduction in workability due to sickness or accidents, and lower levels of meaning from work. As Kristen found there were only 3% of slaughterhouse workers that did not have any somatic or psychological symptoms, such as stress, fatigue, and it was suggested that workers used absence as coping strategy since regulation of job strain was not possible at the workplace itself. Although people are physically and mentally capable of killing, the psychological consequences can be harmful for individuals and their communities. Research by Emhan found that slaughterhouse butchers scored significantly higher compared to retail meat packaging butchers in somatization, anxiety, anger, hostility, and psychoticism. Emotional withdrawal or numbing was recognized as a defense mechanism that removes one's empathical reaction to the other. Additionally, it was found that workers tend to develop mechanized self, a form of coping mechanism that enables them to emotionally disconnect and distance themselves from slaughtering. As well as moral disengagement, justification, rationalization, de-individualization, and diffused responsibility. This can be found also in these other testimonies. And then it gets to a point where you're at a daydream stage, where you can think about everything else and still do your job, and you become emotionally bad. In the 5th edition of Diagnostic and Statistic Manual of Mental Disorder, better known as DSM-5, points out that active participation in violence can also cause trauma in the context of post-traumatic stress disorder, and it adds to the list of causal factors, military personnel being a perpetrator, witnessing atrocities, or killing an enemy. McNair in 2005 proposed the term to describe the phenomenon as perpetration-induced traumatic stress, or PITS. Symptoms are similar to those experienced by victims of trauma, such as flashbacks, nightmares, anxiety, depression, restricted range of emotions, sleep issues, anger issues, and hypervigilance. McNair suggested that slaughterhouse workers could be another occupational group susceptible to perpetration-induced traumatic stress due to the violent nature of their work. Even in less exposed occupations, the negative effect of killing of non-human animals are recognized. As Whiting and Marion point out, it's unclear how we could assist veterinarians to be more resilient of negative effects of delivering a humane killing to livestock. Harmful and dangerous consequences are recognized also in the wider context. Research shows that there is a link between higher crime rates, including total arrests, violent crimes, sexual crimes, and the slaughterhouse employment and slaughterhouse location. The purpose of this longer segue into this topic is to point out what a job description and its consequences are for slaughterhouse butchers. It is a very specific job, and only in the last decades, with changing perceptions of the sentience of animals, that also workers' participatory role in this process has also started to receive more attention from general public and the experts. However, there is still one aspect that is relatively unnoticed in this context, and this is vocational training for butchers. Vocational training programs for butchers are part of school systems in many European Union countries. There are two models that are predominantly used: dual education system and school-based system. The dual education system is a combination of a work-based practical training in company, in form of apprenticeship, and theoretical learning at vocational school. In school-based systems, practical training and theoretical learning are situated at vocational school together with periods of practical training at companies. Students can enroll in vocational training programs after finishing their basic elementary school at the age of 15 or 16. In some countries, they need to be 18. Educational programs for butchers provide them with various skill sets, including slaughtering different kinds of animals, meat cutting, packaging, processing, preparing products, and retailing. Specialization within the profession vary among countries. For example, in Denmark, students can specialize in slaughtering. Curriculum provides detailed information on learning objectives and consequently offer better comprehension of the skill sets and experiences that young people are exposed to during the training. Stunning, slaughtering, and bleeding out. There are three predominant methods for stunning animals in industrial slaughtering. These are mechanical, electrical, and gas. Mechanical methods include the use of captive bolt pistol, which is a gun that fires metal bolt into animal's skull and then returns to its original position in the barrel. The procedure renders animal unconscious as it physically destroys vital center of the brain. There is also non-penetrating form of stun gun where the bolt is mushroom-shaped and its forceful stroke on animal's forehead renders them unconscious. When electrical stunning, when manually operated, an alternating electric current of high frequency and at low voltage is passed through the animal's brain with the use of electrodes placed either on the side of the brain or under the jaw and on the side, on the neck, behind the ears. Head-only electrical stunning causes temporary loss to animals' consciousness, but animals regain consciousness if not quickly killed. After the animals are stunned, they are being hung up or laid down for sticking. Sticking is a technique for bleeding out animals, usually severing the jugular and carotid vessel and causing death by cerebral anoxia. Hollow knives and other special equipment are then used to collect blood from inside of animal for human use. Religious slaughter demands that animals are conscious during the slaughtering process. Butchers sever animals' throat veins and arteries, and the animals are fully conscious during the sticking process. The next is skinning, scalding, and herring. In the cattle, first horns are removed and head is skinned. The head is detached from the carcass by cutting the neck muscles and atlanto-occipital joint. The next stage is removal of the legs and the butt joints, and then proceeding to the skinning of the trunk and preparing for evisceration. This procedure is done either manually with skinning knife requiring physical force or by automatic hide puller. This is a machine that pulls the skin of the animals while they're in hanging position. Hooves are removed using hoof removal scissor. Before pigs are skinned, their hair needs to be removed. This may be done by a number of ways. Immersion system requires that pigs are immersed in water tanks with water temperatures around 60 degrees Celsius in order for their hair follicles to loosen. In manual system, workers move and sink the pigs for about 6 minutes. The deherring process is manually done with scraper or knife, and the remaining hair is eliminated by singeing with a gas torch or burner. Evisceration and cutting of carcasses. At this stage of the slaughtering process, students must carefully cut open pelvic, abdominal, and chest cavity and remove viscera and intestine without puncturing them. Carcasses are washed after veterinary inspection and approval. Butchers split the carcasses down the backbone from pelvis to neck using a power saw or cleaver. For the purpose of further processing and retail, legs, backs, shoulder, and necks are cut into component parts using a saw and cleaver. Brains are removed from the head. The purpose of this detailed description was to get familiar with objectives and skill sets constituting school curriculum for children who have finished elementary school. This brings us to the next segment, where we will look at how normalization of violence towards animals in the food industry is transitioning over into normalization of violence in the context of children and young people and the developmental phase therein. The transitional process from childhood to adulthood encompasses extensive changes in neurological, physical, psychological, and social development. Adolescence is a period when the brain undergoes significant structural and functional changes. These changes take place from around the age of 11 into the mid-20s. Frequently used neural connections become strengthened, whereas unused ones become pruned. Additionally, nerve fibers become coated in myelin, thus strengthening the efficiency and speed of neural communication and connectivity. Development of limbic system, which is in charge of emotions and reward system, is subject to extensive change from the start of puberty. It interacts with the prefrontal cortex, which controls, regulates, and inhibits impulses, but itself becomes fully mature only in the mid-20s. This results with serious deficiency in capacities to This results in less crosstalk among brain regions, leaving teenagers overwhelmed with serious deficiency in capacity to self-regulate. Consequently, when exposed to stressful situations, such as trainings to kill sentient beings, teenagers have diminished capacity to regulate their nervous system. Adolescence is a developmental period when brain development is highly sensitive to the experiences it is exposed to. Every learning experience alters brain neurostructures. As Siegel and others point out, focus, content, repetitive activities, and experiences, whether they are good or bad, strengthen the neurological connections. Teenage experience and memories provided by adult butchers offer some insight into how this work affects young people. The shock induced by environment on this young person in the following extract. When you're at school, it's a very clean environment. You do your physical education once a week, and that's about as hard as it gets. And all of a sudden, you come into a workplace like this, and you're thrust with blood, guts, and gore, basically, the stuff of horror movies. In another example, a 70-year-old man had overcome his natural revulsion to cut open the head of a pig. I was just thrust into a situation like this. You will be going to cut pig's head in half and put the brains out. And it's like, okay, you know, you're a 17-year-old lad, but it's the initiating of doing it. I found being trained that the shock factor meant a lot because it would break through the barriers of squeamishness. In the context of normalization of violence towards non-human animals in teenage brain development, there are two relatively new angles that also need to be considered. And this is the mirror neuron system and empathy. So let's first look at mirror neuron system. It was discovered in primates in 1980s by Rizzolatti. Later, they were recognized in humans and also in other animals such as songbirds. This system is the new neural mechanism that mirrors emotions, sensations, behaviors, and actions of others. Research has shown that when a person observes another individual, their brain becomes activated as if they were experiencing those states themselves. Furthermore, activation of mirror neuron system appears to be automatic and non-conscious. Although the possible roles are still being debated, a growing body of literature brings important new insights into the human capacity to share various states observed by others. Research studies have shown that presented evidence for human ability to mirror action, pain, touch, and other emotions. Jackson, for example, presented their subject with static image of a knife cutting a hand. Cheng in their study showed participants a video of needles being inserted into human body. Results in both studies showed that the areas in observer's brain connected to the perception and sensation of pain were activated. Research results on human mirroring capacity indicate that seeing someone experiencing touch, disgust, or pain triggers much more in us than a purely theoretical, disembodied interpretation of other people's mental states. The function of mirror neuron system has important implication when considering students' qualitative and quantitative experiences in the course of the adolescent brain development, and additionally in the context of butcher training. Empathy. We are born with empathy, with our brains hardwired for empathy. It's an ability that helps us recognize the feelings, intentions, and needs of others. As such, it has been recognized as one of the most important components of human experience, and because it motivates in us pro-social behavior. Different brain centers, genetics, and various contextual factors such as temperament, parenting, and experiences potentially result in empathy that can be modulated, and even very young children are capable of displaying various empathic behaviors. However, empathy is not an automatic process, as its expression depends on environmental contributions in the form of stimulation and promotion of prosocial behavior by learning, strengthening, and internalizing. Schoenfeld and their team found high mental well-being was associated with enhanced empathy, and also strengthened immune system, greater satisfaction in personal and professional relationships, and better coping with stress. Maya Albiol and his team have found that empathy and violence share a part of the same brain circuit as and as a consequence cannot be expressed simultaneously. Violence has an inhibitory effect over empathy and vice versa. The behavior that is more stimulated by the experiences, learning, and impulses from our social environment is the one that gets more developed in our brain. The focus of this presentation was to look at the consequences of butchering tradition in the context of modern educational system and the latest scientific findings. The purpose of tradition is transmission of customs or beliefs from generation to generation, and the goal is preserving the habits that enrich us and our culture. However, this paper is presenting a practice that is supporting and normalizing violent behavior towards sentient beings. This phenomenon of professional violence appears to be so inherently normal and acceptable that it's seldom questioned and thus evades rigorous scrutiny. Vocational training for butchers is an example where the inconsistency of norm regarding violence and context-dependent violence normalization come into play. On one hand, as Askeon and others point out, abuse and killing of animals perpetrated by children and young people are considered mental health issues, and this form of behavior is often considered an early indicator of future psychopathology. On the other hand, when children are trained to stun, kill, bleed out the skin and cut up animals, even at the cost of their own mental health and harmful consequences for their adult life, this behavior is deemed acceptable and is promoted to such extent that this is a part of educational systems in the EU. In contrast with other educational programs, these presentations show that violent acts can be associated with inhibition of empathy, desensitization to violence, moral disengagement from actions and significant long-term negative mental health consequences. Indicating the occupation of a butcher can be considered potentially psychologically damaging to the individual doing the job, likely negative consequences for the individual's family and wider society. Furthermore, workplace-related violent content needs to be considered also within the developmental period of teenage students. Adolescence is namely an important developmental stage with structural and organizational changes in the brain. Learning content and experiences in this period might significantly influence the direction of their brain development. How beneficial to young people's development is an education program where killing and dismembering is key occupational characteristic and slaughterhouse is a learning environment. Although as a society we strive to provide children with safe and thriving environment, and for this purpose we have declarations and programs such as United Nations Convention on the Rights of Children and Sustainable Development Goals that serves as a framework for governments and societies to prioritize and work toward well-being of children. They provide guidance and policies and actions needed to ensure that children grow up safe, healthy, and in nurturing environments. However, the case of teenage butchers is positioned in the blind spot of such conventions because as a society we normalize the violence towards animals. Due to normalization of violence towards non-human animals through the vocational training of butchers, each year a group of children is not provided with equal learning conditions compared to the students in other educational programs in terms of safe, thriving, creative, and stimulating environment. This paper shows that normalization in the context of the food industry has no effect and does not alter the actual consequences that normalized violent behavior has on its victims and on its agents. Although the case of butchers is a pedagogical program that should be re-evaluated in the light of the latest scientific findings, is in itself just a symptom of a much larger problem. The root problem is normalization of violence towards non-human animals that we consider resources. The case of teenage butchers provides us with the most clear and obvious insight into harmful dynamics and consequences that normalization of violence generates. In that way, it has the potential to be the precedent case with which we can start breaking down the structuralized normalization of violence towards non-human animals. In the past, our choices have been limited because our knowledge has been limited. Now the information is available and it comes down to us making a choice and being accountable. When we allow children and animals to suffer, we lose humanity. And we shouldn't give it up so easily as we are doing it right now. Thank you.